Daniel, a 28-year-old lifeguard, was spending another routine day on the sunny beach of Malibu, California. The scent of sunscreen and the salty breeze were constant companions, and the rhythm of the waves breaking on the shore was the soundtrack of his life. From his chair, his eyes scanned the sea, noting every movement, every unsupervised child, every daring swimmer. It was a calm, almost monotonous day, with families enjoying the sun and surfers challenging the small waves that formed. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine, something cold and icy that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. The laughter of the children in the water seemed distant, muffled. A dizziness hit him, and the sand beneath his feet seemed to spin. He closed his eyes for an instant, seeking stability. When he opened them, the landscape transformed. The blue sky turned a sickly lead gray, the sun disappeared, and the once calm sea regurgitated dark, menacing foam. Then, it appeared. Not an ordinary wave, but an immense, greenish wall of water that rose to touch the clouds, swallowing the horizon. He saw umbrellas ripped away, towels flying like paper birds, and screams of panic mixing with the deafening roar of the water mass. People ran, stumbled, stretched out their hands in desperation, but it was too late. The wave crashed down with unimaginable fury, dragging everything and everyone to the bottom, turning the vibrant Malibu beach into a submerged graveyard. The vision focused on him, trapped underwater, the current pulling him into the darkness, the light from the surface receding inexorably. Despair, cold and sharp, embraced him. Daniel gasped, air filling his lungs with a harsh sound. He opened his eyes again, and the Malibu sun blinded him for an instant. The children's laughter returned, clear and present. The waves, soft and inviting, broke on the shore. He was back, in the lifeguard chair, his heart pounding uncontrollably in his chest. However, the vision was so vivid, so real, that the tranquility of the beach now seemed like a cruel illusion. The smell of sunscreen seemed to have a bitter tang. He tried to stand, his legs wobbly. The voice of his conscience screamed, "Warn them. Run. Now." But how? Who would believe him? The clock on his wrist seemed to have stopped. The silence was deafening, despite all the noise from the beach. He felt something watching him, a cold, invisible shadow. He turned, but there was no one there. Or was there? Daniel's strangled cry died in his throat. He tried desperately to warn people. He climbed down from the chair, running across the hot sand, his voice hoarse from shouting, "Evacuate! Get out of the water!" Few heard him above the cheerful hum of the beach. Those who noticed him simply looked at him with curiosity, some with irritation at the interruption of their peace. The tsunami alarm, a rusty panel a few feet from the lifeguard tower, stubbornly refused to respond, a dry, metallic sound echoing with each frustrated attempt. The wind, previously a gentle breeze, became strong, carrying his words away, turning them into inaudible whispers. Daniel felt the ground vibrate. A subtle tremor, almost imperceptible to most, but for him, it was the harbinger of the end. He looked at the horizon. Far, far away, a dark smudge began to form. It was her. The giant wave, exactly as in his premonition. There was no more time. In a primary instinct for survival, he ran, not towards the ocean, but towards the boardwalk, pushing people in front of him, shouting for them to go up, to get away from the coast. Amidst the growing chaos, he saw the young surfer Sarah, who always greeted him with a smile, being dragged back by the force of the initial wave, but managing to cling to a palm tree at the edge of the boardwalk, her face pale with terror. Further ahead, Mr. Henderson, a retiree who spent his mornings reading his newspaper on the beach, stumbled and fell, but his granddaughter, Emily, an agile 12-year-old girl, managed to pull him to the safety of the retaining wall in time. They escaped. Barely. Daniel, in turn, was thrown against the boardwalk wall, the force of the water crushing him before the main wave swallowed everything. He felt the darkness before his head hit hard and the world turned upside down. When consciousness returned, Daniel was in a makeshift hospital, amidst hundreds of shocked survivors. Sarah, with a few scratches, sat on a nearby bed, her eyes fixed on nothing. Mr. Henderson, wrapped in a thermal blanket, looked out the window, where the destruction of the beach was visible. The media, in a frenzy, covered the event as the unexpected Malibu tsunami. Reports spoke of an anomalous wave, unprecedented, that appeared without warning, defying all weather forecasts. Every detail, every description of the impact, of the devastation, eerily matched Daniel's vision. "It was as if the sea suddenly swallowed us," Sarah murmured to a nurse, her eyes wide. Daniel heard her. He felt like a castaway from reality, trapped between the madness of his premonition and the terrible truth unfolding before him. No one, not even Sarah or Mr. Henderson, seemed to understand the extent of what had happened, the almost supernatural way that wave appeared out of nowhere. To them, it was a natural tragedy. To Daniel, it was death personified. A growing paranoia consumed him. Had death let him escape? Or was it just waiting for the right moment to finish its job? Weeks passed, and life in Malibu, for the survivors, was a shadow of what it once was. Daniel tried to resume his routine, but every wave breaking on the beach, every stronger breeze, made him relive the horror. He avoided the ocean, unable to face the treacherous expanse. Paranoia followed him like a shadow, a constant feeling that something was wrong, that the danger hadn't truly passed. One day, the news hit him like a punch to the gut. Sarah, the young surfer who had clung to the palm tree, died. Not in a car accident, nor from an illness. Sarah had died in a bizarre fatality during a training session in an Olympic swimming pool. Daniel learned the details from television. Sarah was preparing for a competition, performing a series of dives. In one of these dives, the diving board, newly installed and supposedly safe, inexplicably gave way. Sarah lost her balance and fell awkwardly, hitting her head on the edge of the pool before falling into the water. The worst, however, came next. The pool's drainage lever, which no one knew why it was activated, suddenly opened, creating a powerful whirlpool that pulled her to the bottom, trapping her in the suction grates. The panic among the other swimmers was immediate, but the lifeguards were slow to react, as if paralyzed. When they finally managed to pull her out, it was too late. Daniel felt an icy chill. A board giving way. A lever opening on its own. The paralysis of the lifeguards. It was a sequence of improbable events, a series of chained accidents, like in the horror movies he watched as a child. And Sarah, the tsunami survivor, was the victim. He began to see the pattern, the invisible web that death wove. Sarah's death was not an isolated accident, it was a continuation of the premonition, a cruel irony of fate. She had escaped the ocean, only to be claimed by the water of a swimming pool. He sought out Mr. Henderson, the only other person who seemed to share the same strange survival. He found him in the park, reading his newspaper, oblivious to Sarah's tragedy. Daniel tried to explain his theory, the feeling that death was hunting them, one by one. Mr. Henderson, with his usual calm, merely nodded, a skeptical smile on his lips. "Daniel, my boy," he said, folding the newspaper. "I understand you're shaken. But accidents happen. That's life. There's no evil entity hunting us. It's just bad luck, the randomness of existence." Daniel felt a wave of frustration. Mr. Henderson, with his pragmatic view, was the skeptic of the story, unable to see the truth that tormented him. But Daniel knew. Death had not finished its work in Malibu. It was just beginning to collect its debt. And now, Daniel wondered, who would be next? Mr. Henderson's skepticism only reinforced Daniel's conviction. He spent days and nights in his small apartment, the mental map of the premonition and subsequent accidents forming in his head. The tsunami, Sarah in the pool. There was a link, an invisible thread connecting these tragedies. Daniel began to piece together the order of events, looking for logic, a pattern, anything that could predict Death's next move. The tension grew with each beat of his heart. He knew who would be next. Emily. Mr. Henderson's granddaughter. She had pulled her grandfather to safety. She was connected to him, to his escape, to his initial survival. Daniel felt a cold dread. How could he save her? How could he warn someone who didn't believe in his madness? He tried. He called Mr. Henderson, but he didn't answer. He went to their house, but the door was locked. Daniel waited, his heart pounding, imagining the most terrible scenarios. With each passing minute, the anguish increased. Finally, he saw Emily leaving home with her backpack, going to school. She waved to Daniel with a smile. Relief. But a voice in his mind whispered, "Not yet." The tragedy came in the afternoon. Daniel received a call from the school. Emily had died in a science lab accident. Another sequence of bizarre events, worthy of a movie script. During a seemingly harmless chemical reaction demonstration, an unknown reagent bottle, which shouldn't have been on the shelf, fell. The impact caused a gas nozzle, which mysteriously wasn't working properly, to come loose, releasing gas. The spark from a nearby experiment, inexplicably stronger than usual, ignited the gas, causing a small explosion that hit Emily directly. She had leaned at the wrong moment, in the wrong place. Daniel arrived at the hospital, where Mr. Henderson was in shock, his eyes vacant. She was so excited about the science project, he murmured, tears streaming down his aged face. How? How could this have happened? Daniel couldn't answer. He knew. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't randomness. It was death. It couldn't be easily cheated. It had claimed its second victim, with surgical precision, as if each piece of the puzzle was being carefully fitted. Emily's death, an innocent child who had pulled her grandfather from the edge of the ocean, sealed the pattern. Death was tracking them, one by one, using what had saved them as the key to their demise. He felt something watching him, a cold and patient presence, satisfied with the completion of another cycle. The clock on his wrist seemed to have stopped. The silence was deafening. Emily's death was the catalyst. Mr. Henderson, now stripped of his skepticism, looked at Daniel with eyes full of newfound terror. They were the only two survivors of the tsunami tragedy left, and death was clearly on their trail. "We need to find out," Mr. Henderson said, his voice trembling. "How does it know? How does it find them?" The investigation began. They locked themselves in Daniel's apartment, surrounded by old newspaper clippings, internet articles, and accident files. They searched for patterns, connections between seemingly random events. It was hours of feverish research, fueled by fear and despair. And then, they found them. Stories similar to theirs. A family who survived a fire, only to die in a series of inexplicable accidents. A group of friends who escaped a plane crash, only to be pursued by a relentless fate. Always the same pattern, the initial escape, followed by chained, bizarre deaths, using elements of their own salvation as instruments of their ruin. They tried to break the cycle, Daniel murmured, reading an article about a group of firefighters who had skipped their turn in an incident, only to meet death in other ways. Skipping a turn, switching places. They decided to try. Mr. Henderson, a former accountant, had an important meeting scheduled for the next day, an appointment in a tall building in downtown Los Angeles. Daniel, thinking of the fall, the impact, suggested he skip his turn, that he send someone else in his place, that he not go. Mr. Henderson agreed, canceling the meeting and claiming an indisposition. The attempt worked momentarily. The day passed without incident. A small victory, a thread of hope. But death was not so easily deceived. That same night, as Daniel and Mr. Henderson discussed the success of their strategy, the phone rang. It was the accounting firm. Mr. Henderson's substitute had died. Not in a fall from the building, but in a pile-up on the freeway, on his way to the meeting Mr. Henderson was supposed to have attended. The panic increased, suffocating. Death didn't care who the victim was, only that the number of its destiny was fulfilled. It had found a way to collect the debt, even if it was through someone else. The apartment window was open, and the wind brought a cold whisper, as if death were laughing. Daniel felt something watching him. The clock stopped. The silence was deafening. He turned, but there was no one there. Or was there? Only Daniel and Mr. Henderson remained. With each death, each impossible accident, death seemed to draw closer, tightening its grip. Mr. Henderson, once skeptical, was now a man broken by fear, his old eyes reflecting the terror they felt. "What do we do, Daniel?" he whispered, his hands trembling. "It's going to get us." Daniel felt a cold determination. One last plan. A daring one. They had tried to run, to hide, to skip a turn. Nothing had worked. Death always found its way. But what if they challenged it directly? What if they tried to trick it at its own game, not by running, but by facing the premonition? Daniel's premonition, the starting point of all the horror, had been the giant wave that dragged him to the bottom. What if he, Daniel, the lifeguard who couldn't save anyone, faced the water again? Not on a beach, not in a tsunami, but in a controlled environment, of his own choosing. They went to the Olympic swimming pool where Sarah had died. The place was empty, silent, a somber echo of the tragedy. The tension was at its maximum. Daniel took a deep breath, the smell of chlorine filling his nostrils. He would get into the pool, dive to the bottom, and try to spend as much time as possible there. If death wanted him, let it take him at that moment, on his own terms. It was an act of desperation, of defiance. He jumped in. The cold water enveloped his body, and he dove, eyes open, looking for any sign of death. Mr. Henderson, standing at the edge, watched with bated breath. Daniel swam to the bottom, the pressure of the water in his ears. He closed his eyes, waiting for the whirlpool, for the board to fall, for any sign of the lethal presence. But nothing happened. The water remained calm. He surfaced, gasping, his heart still pounding, but alive. He tried again, and again. For hours, Daniel dove, swam, faced the water that should have taken him. And he survived. Mr. Henderson, initially skeptical, felt a growing relief. It seemed that, finally, they had broken the cycle. Death, perhaps, had grown tired of its game. The feeling was strange. A false sense of security. The following days were unusually calm, almost eerie. News of inexplicable accidents disappeared. The shadows dissipated. It seemed that everything had returned to normal. Daniel and Mr. Henderson embraced, the exhaustion of fighting the inevitable weighing on them, but also a faint flame of hope. They had won. For now. He felt something watching him, a distant, almost imperceptible presence. The clock on his wrist seemed to have stopped. The silence was deafening. He turned, but there was no one there. Or was there? Months later, Daniel was in another place, far from Malibu, in a small town in rural Oregon, working as a swimming instructor at a local gym. He was trying to resume his life, the nightmares of the tsunami and subsequent deaths diminishing in intensity, turning into distant, painful memories. Mr. Henderson, in turn, had moved to Florida, seeking a new beginning in a place where the sea was less threatening. Daniel was at peace, or as close to peace as a man who had faced death could be. He had found a new routine, new friends. The smell of chlorine from the gym pool was a constant reminder of his silent victory. A subtle sequence of coincidences began. Small events, almost imperceptible. A cup holder that suddenly slipped in his car. A faucet that began to drip persistently in his house. A newspaper that, inexplicably, always opened to the obituary page. He ignored it. Coincidences. The mind, he thought, was just looking for patterns where none existed. One day, while Daniel was teaching a swimming lesson to children, he felt a strange sting on the back of his neck. Not an insect bite, but something deeper, colder. He ignored it, focusing on the children's laughter. The water in the pool was stirred by small arms and legs, but the movement was joyful, not threatening. A snap. He felt an unexpected weight on his back, as if something was pulling him down. A muffled scream. He couldn't identify where it came from. Not from the children, not from Mr. Henderson. It was his own scream, or what was left of it. Daniel's vision blurred. The pool water, once clear and blue, began to turn dark, murky, like the ocean water in his premonition. The current pulled him down, with relentless force, and he recognized the feeling. Death. It had found him. And silence filled the room. No one saw. No one heard. Fate, patient and cruel, finally completed its cycle. Daniel, the lifeguard who had escaped the giant wave, met his end in the calm, safe gym pool, carried away by an invisible current, a final pull, as if the ocean, in its vastness, had sent an emissary to collect the overdue debt. Death always wins. And Daniel was just another silent testament to its unconquerable persistence.